And I took one of these pins and I put it on my lapel, forgot about it. But as I walk into his office, he looks at me pretty strange and he said, "So how's that going?" And I didn't know what he meant. And then I realized the pin said "reformed racist."
Welcome to Winning the Away Game. Season 3 is a new format for us. One guest, one story, one deep conversation. Today's guest is Wayne Hendricks, Head of Global Security for MetLife. He has spent more than 30 years working across corporate security, law enforcement, and military environments, including senior roles at Macquarie and Goldman Sachs International. Before that, Wayne was protection team lead for President Nelson Mandela, which gives this conversation a very different kind of weight. Wayne, welcome to Winning the Away Game. Flip, are you ready?
I'm so excited, Justinus. Very excited for what Season 3 is going to give us. Going to learn from what makes South Africans win the away game. Wayne Hendricks, great to have you on. I'm sure we have great stories to tell. Where are you chatting to us from?
Thanks, Flip. Thanks, Justinus. Really appreciate. I'm an hour directly north of New York City, in a small town called Chappaqua. It's well known for where former President Bill Clinton lives and former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton lives. There's also other people. Matt Damon lives down the street, and Martha Stewart lives down the street. I think that's good. I'm not sure sometimes, but they live in close proximity.
A lot of people to protect, I'm sure. So we have a little tradition on the show, Wayne, where we ask our guests for their favorite Springbok rugby memory, but you're not allowed to say it's Joel Stransky and the 1995 drop goal.
It's a weird story. It is connected to the 1995 World Cup because I was kind of there, and I can tell you. I have a funny story. We were driving towards the stadium, and I worked for President Mandela then. We're driving towards the stadium, and I'm in a car with a colleague of mine then. And if you kind of recall, it was a very kind of contentious, kind of interesting time that South Africa was in. I was driving towards in a kind of a very kind of overt police car. And my colleague is sitting next to me, and her name is very relevant to the punchline. She's sitting next to me, and as we're sitting, there's a kind of a bucky pulls up with a bunch of guys in khaki uniforms, and they pull up next to us, and she's a black colleague of mine, and the window's open, and they're looking at us very strangely because I'm this guy. I look a particular kind of way, and she obviously looks different. And we're late. We're trying to get to the stadium before Madiba obviously arrives there, and they're starting to make some interesting comments. Not too bad, but probably not appropriate. And I say to her to roll the window up, but I call her on her name, so I say, "Precious, roll up the window," because her name was Precious. This kind of triggered them into all sorts of kind of extreme emotions and further comments, by the way. I remember that because from there on to getting to the stadium, I can't remember who made the drop kick. Nobody looked after President Mandela at that point. I just can tell you that for certain. He was on his own when that kind of happened. I regrouped afterwards, and then we kind of obviously did the whole thing and the cup, the trophy ceremony.
That's amazing, and I obviously read the background, and we should have thought about it, but leading up to that, and I've spoken to family and friends about 1994. It's obviously too young and too isolated to take everything in what happened, but take us through the World Cup, being next to Nelson Mandela, the organization, the security, everything going on in the world. Take us through what you felt, what was the immense proud, the fear factor that was going on.
I was no, thank you, and just to be clear, I was brand new in the team. I was probably the youngest, most junior team member. Just joined the team, and I remember that we were all. There were kind of two teams. There was the kind of ANC team that became part of the team. Then there was us as typical kind of South African, either coming from President F.W. de Klerk's team or former President P.W. Botha's team. So we came together, and it was contentious. It was difficult. We were all kind of struggling with figuring out, establishing a new identity, not just in protection, but kind of us as individuals. And I grew up in the Eastern Cape on a farm, so for me, it was a far cry from where I was faced now with something very different. I was used to think about people in a very different way than all of a sudden where I was then. And I've always thought it's such a lazy, intellectually lazy, or even kind of emotionally lazy way to put people in a certain box because of what they look like, or how much money they have, or their background. I've always kind of wondered about that. And I think that the lead up to the 95 World Cup and beyond that gave me this kind of opportunity to reset my life as well, and kind of learn about this. And I have this story, Flip, where brand new, and we're at the old house in Houghton. You'll hear a lot of people coming from that talking about the old house in Houghton and the new house in Houghton. But the old house in Houghton, and I was tasked as the most junior member to go and fetch Madiba at his office and then walk him with his briefcase to the new car. A lot of people would send him lapel pins and all type of paraphernalia and swag from around the world. And I took one of these pins and I put it on my lapel, forgot about it. But as I walk into his office, I think he looks at me pretty strange, and he said, "So how's that going?" And I didn't know what he meant. And this is the first interaction with the kind of then. And then I realized the pin said "reformed racist." So which I probably should have taken off. And I said to him, trying to think on my feet, I said to him, "Listen, it's a journey. I'm kind of working on it." And he laughed and I laughed, and he asked me where I was from, and I said from the Eastern Cape, and we fell into Xhosa then, which was kind of my first language, English being my third language. So if I get some of the vocabulary wrong, forgive me. And there was a weird connection that I was completely shocked that he treated me as an equal, didn't treat me any different to anybody else. And that continued throughout the time I kind of worked for him. And that's also the person, not to jump ahead, Flip, but that's also the person I am today. I treat everybody exactly the same. It's always become my kind of brand to a big degree, and I think a lot of people that have been close to him have kind of learned that as well. So fast forward, sorry, to take a step back, I'm sorry. If I take a step back, over that time, we got to know people that we have never thought we would, and he set the tone for that. And I think there are hard lessons here in the US from a political perspective. I know, Flip, in Europe, in the UK, probably the whole world, where we don't have that leadership anymore.
What's amazing for me about that story, and I have a similar one of what happened to me, is when you get into that context and you interact with somebody that's so different from what you're expected, and they act in a way that's so driven by that humility and that human connection, it completely changes almost the way you think, and it changes you as a person, because for me it was like, okay, I have a new standard now I think I want to hold myself to.
Oh, for sure. I think it takes a little bit of EQ as well. I think you have to, if you're that kind of continuous learner and you're critical and you can develop empathy. So you can say, well, hang on, what are other people thinking about this topic, or how are they experiencing that I'm clearly experiencing something very different? And I've always liked the point about you could, this is kind of the whole thing about Maslow and Herzberg, but you can give people a lot of resources and money and cars and wealth and so on. If they don't have a sense of dignity, if they don't have that, that's kind of hard to give to people. I wonder how many people have lost, to your point, Justinus, how many people do not have those memories of how we got to where we are and why it's important to protect how hard we've worked to reset the country. There's an interesting point. Somebody in the NYPD here told me last week that more than 50% of people in the NYPD were not born when 9/11 happened. So they don't make the connection in terms of how we got here. And I guess that's kind of our jobs.
and I'm pretty sure we'll get back to those stories, because there's a couple of snippets that came out there, very interesting. But then almost they're going from rock star life to ending up in Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I never took the plunge. I traveled Flip heavily to Australia, working for an Australian company, but I never did it, and partly is because my wife is a born and bred New Yorker, so that's part of the reason. But also, in my industry, I can learn a lot more living in the US. You could say the same thing for the UK or Europe, but Australia, from a risk perspective, is very far removed from the rest of the world. So if you think about what happens in Australia, if you think about it through a lens of terrorism or cyber or technology, it's a different world versus, for example, the learnings that have already taken place in the US. But I'll tell you a fun fact. I've worked at Macquarie for 17 years, and I traveled to Sydney, Australia during those 17 years 196 times. And that's just one kind of block of travel, and excludes all the other things. So I'm pretty familiar with and sometimes they hard coincided with rugby games as well. I'm not sure if that's a coincidence or how it happened.
Or a feature, it was designed that way.
Yeah, we've got to find a lot of people. You get to Hong Kong when the Sevens are there, and
you just happen to be there. Yeah.
I may or may not have a business trip to Baltimore in September as well.
Of course, yeah. So tell us. Let's go back to the beginning. Eastern Cape. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? And how did you end up working for Madiba?
I didn't plan any of that, by the way. Justinus grew up originally in Port Elizabeth. Went to school in Brandwag in Uitenhage. Then kind of transitioned over to living on a farm outside of Patterson in the Eastern Cape. It's like 70 kilometers, again, directly north from Port Elizabeth. Kind of grew up on a farm there. Went to boarding school my whole life in Uitenhage. I fell in love with rugby then. It's my favorite sport, but by far. I love rugby. I think it teaches you extreme humility, almost like golf, but it teaches humility in a team sense. And I'm kind of teaching you how to suck eggs here, so please forgive me. Not the intention, but it teaches you how to work with other people. It certainly, for me, that time, kind of we had a great kind of a rugby team and rugby school, by the way. So we did this kind of rugby weekends away. We would go all around the Eastern Cape. We will go right up to George, Knysna, Punt, high school in kind of Mossel Bay, I think. But so we did all of this, and I fell in love with spending time with my friends and this kind of extreme focus about kind of one sport that made all of us kind of type of equal. Spent my whole life in the Eastern Cape. Went to the military. Went to the army, conscription. Then went to the military for the army for 2 years. My mother wanted me to, and I wanted to become a marine biologist. I love kind of animals. I love being outside, and never became, because I didn't know how to transition from the army into a world where I had to go and sit with people maybe 2-3 years younger than me in a classroom somewhere. I didn't know how to do it. I could probably have done it logistically. Didn't know how to do that, and so went into law enforcement in the South African Police. Never wanted to be there. Not because I don't massively love law enforcement. It didn't seem like a means to an end. It seemed like, it always felt like a transition period for me. And then completely by accident, got into VIP protection because of my military background. Got into VIP protection. A lot of us got an opportunity to ask then, hey, do you want to transition and work for Presidential Protection Unit then, which is very contentious, by the way. Imagine this kind of guy that was just released from prison. You all want to have to go and work for him. And a lot of the people still believed the war stories. And to be very direct here, the brainwashing that we all went through during the apartheid years of these people are bad and evil and they want to get rid of everybody. And for a long time, I believed that. I think the first time I started to question this was when I was in the army. I was in special operations where there were black and white people then. There was the only kind of units with kind of black and white people in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. So when I got there, I was very confused by, these people were kind of my best friends. They kind of had my back. We went through a lot of painful sweat and tears experiences together. And that put me on a path when I got into VIP protection and then presidential protection. I think I was better prepared for this world we are now kind of stepping into. And a lot of people were not. They were still in this weirdness of if we just run out the clock, we'll get back to where we are comfortable. And I think those are valuable lessons also about life. Those people who can lean into being uncomfortable and learning and dealing with new things and change, those are the people that win. And it was hard because then we didn't have kind of social media or anything, if you obviously remember. So all the information came from the government.
If we remember a day before social media.
I missed those days actually. But that's the long story short. Didn't plan it. I studied while I was working for Madiba, because I always thought this was transitory. This was also always just a step to something else. Yeah.
So I've got two things there that jumped out at me. One is I call it these personal revelations. So for me as well, growing up in apartheid in the 80s in Pretoria, I very much had the worldview that was produced as a result of the propaganda and the context that I grew up in. And one day I walked into a classroom, and for the first time I was surrounded by people that was representative of the real demographics of the country. But all of those things I was taught to believe was obviously false. You were a bunch of people that was just as smart as I am, just as hardworking. We really just wanted. So you mentioned that sort of same personal revelation that you had when you start to realize interacting with people that contradict this worldview that you've had, and then it starts to unravel. What I find challenging, though, is talking to people who's not had that personal revelation and hasn't had the opportunity really yet to interact with people on that level and still underlyingly believe some of those things that we grew up with. How do you handle those conversations?
Listen, I think it's I had one of those recently. I had somebody, I was standing, my son plays rugby here in Rye, under 12 rugby, which I'm very proud of. And I was standing next to the field with kind of all parents. We were kind of standing around there. And I had somebody have a very anti-Semitic conversation. And, immediately you're faced with, do you just kind of walk away? Right, so us South Africans struggle with that sometimes. But do you walk away, or do you kind of, again, do you approach this person and either you two routes, right? You say, hey, explain that to me, because maybe I'm missing something, genuinely, or maybe you literally take that person to task and say, hang on, I don't think that's kind of appropriate, and I think it's a lot about telling the stories. I don't think it works by hitting people over the head every time they have a different view, or because I think you're going to run out of people. There's only 8 billion of us on the planet. So I think a better way of doing it is literally, I think storytelling is powerful. I think telling people a story and saying, right, if you think we are different because of whatever you think and you've heard, and a lot of people struggle with the fact that two things can be true at the same time. You can believe something strongly and still figure things out, and you not have the right information. And also, you can at the same time, you can also agree that the alternative is also true. I'll give you a quick example. There's a big discussion at the moment about immigration, meaning people coming into country, whether that's in the US or to Europe or to the UK. And I look at it and I'm saying it's a good thing, but we can do it better in a more structured way. in a more kind of regulated way. So I agree with both. I think that's where people struggle. Now, you asked me the question, Justinus. Sometimes you just also have to just walk away and say, I don't want to be part of the discussion. And I think when you get older, you wouldn't know, Justinus, because you're still in your 20s. But when you get to 85, like me and Flip, right? Then sorry, Flip, to put you in that bucket as well. But I'm talking through the lens of experience and rugged good looks. But if you sometimes you just say, this is not me, and my values are just too detached from that. If you think for a second, everybody that you put in a particular bucket is a bad person, always bad, by the way, versus sometimes make mistakes. And other people are always good and never make mistakes or cannot be bad as well. I think you've not spent enough time on the planet.
Because no situation is ever that clear-cut, right? It's always more complex.
Yeah. And I think it's powerful. It's powerful to say sorry. I think it's powerful to admit that you're wrong. I think it comes back to my point about empathy, or even beyond empathy. I think compassion is like kind of adding the kind of emotion to that as well.
Don't you think, Wayne, the fact that we South Africans make us more susceptible and we have more tools to handle situations like that?
I think we are, and I think. So this is very controversial, but I've been accused of being controversial a long time. So I'll tread carefully. Justinus is sitting right with the button, whatever the red button
Mute
is.
button.
But, the explode button. But I think most South Africans that I've connected with, that I've found somewhere in my travels and here in the US, are inherently, objectively successful. They're successful because of exactly your point, Flip. I think they're successful because, and I did a LinkedIn post recently, right? I hire people who have grit and perseverance, people who can see around corners, meaning people who can anticipate what's coming. Now, you can only anticipate that if you've walked the walk and you've actually kind of lived that movie. But I do think South Africans absolutely have that. And I think even now, with a lot of kind of bad stuff happening in the world, and South Africa being in an interesting place, South Africans they show up and they find that positivity, right? They find that silver lining, and they go and be entrepreneurial, or they innovate, or they dip below the line, and then they go on and work hard. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. Now, we're not unique in that for sure, but I do think our past gives us a unique recipe for that. Completely agree, Flip.
So what was the hardest for you in that transition? Maybe let's go back. So when did the opportunity, or how did you end up deciding to move out of South Africa, and what was the impetus?
I anticipated this question, and I studied for it, and I'm probably going to botch it. So here goes. I don't know, because I always, there's a great friend of mine that runs I think one of the biggest security companies, executive protection companies in Africa. He lives in Cape Town. That's the only downside, because he's a Stormers supporter. But that aside, I'll forgive him for that. But I won't out him on this podcast. But he always talks about he's not leaving the country. He's contributing, and he's going to be part of the solution. And I aggressively agree with him on that. But at the same time, I thought about my children, right? And I thought about giving opportunities for my children, in the hope, by the way, I've not said this out loud in a long time, in the hope that one day they will return to South Africa and keep on kind of building that we're all building. I also think, I've never thought about, if I can digress for a second, Justinus, I've always believed that the only thing that separates us, the three of us, or a girl in a small village in Nigeria, or a little boy in London, is geography and timing. It's nothing else. If you were born in a fancy, very wealthy mansion in London, and I'm born in a very poor village somewhere in Siberia, in Russia. And we are 2 years old, both of us, and we swap for tragic reasons. We get adopted by the inverse. You go to Siberia, and I go to London, and we just literally swap. Then we're going to grow up in what that geography is going to give us. So looking at people only through where they are now versus who they can be. I think that's the extreme superpower. I left the country never thinking that I could not contribute and be a great South African and support my country, but I have to be in a specific geographic location to be able to do that. I've never thought about that way, and I think two things again can be true at the same time. I did it mostly for my children, but I was always drawn to learning new things. I was always drawn to not living outside South Africa, but any place that can teach me new things. So I spent a lot of time in Libya. I spent a lot of time in Mozambique. My claim to fame, my only claim to fame, I've been to all 57 African countries. So I know it's kind of very, and I love doing that. So you can learn different things, because a lot of people, especially where I live now, think Africa is kind of one place. It's extremely diverse. And I'm not sure if you know Bob that lives in Nairobi, because I get this question all the time. Do you know Bob that lives in Nairobi? Like, nope, I don't know him. Which one of the 250,000? So it's just geography.
That's such a cool, but because I couldn't agree more. I mean, I often talk about these two examples. One, that if I was born 15 kilometers north of where I was born in Mamelodi, at exactly the same day as I was born, how my life would have been different, and what would I have been doing in the late 80s and early 90s. And I often say is I would have been the most ardent terrorist and fighting the oppression as much as I possibly can. I would have been never gone to school. I would have been part of riots. I would have done everything I could to try and change the system. And then the other thing we often, and mean seeing that we're rugby fans, I'm super passionate about, if we can create for every kid, and if we just take the poorest part of the country, the Eastern Cape, if we can create the same opportunities I had in Pretoria East for every kid in the Eastern Cape, I think it's a foregone conclusion that South Africa will win 5 of the next 10 World Cups, because the talent that will come out of there would be unbelievable. So just the lottery of your birthplace has such an insane impact in where you end up in life that we cannot underestimate that.
I was when I worked at Goldman Sachs, I was based in London, and Goldman started an initiative called the Africa Education Initiative, and I literally kind of navigated to be part of that, being a security guy. And there was a guy, I'll mention his name, Andrew Davenport. He's now retired from Goldman, but he ran this, and he's still phenomenal in philanthropic initiatives in Africa. But we try to find places that nobody's ever seen a Westerner. So we drive out of Nairobi, Kenya, past Lake Naivasha. We go out kind of literally in the sticks, and we find this kind of tiny school, and we all got there to be prepared to go and educate people and tell people a story. And it was just me and Andrew. And there's a little girl, her name is Rebecca. I asked everybody, because I was now part of it and I liked it. And I asked everybody, what do you want to be? And everybody said, who do you want to be? And this little girl stood up, Rebecca, and she said, I want to be a pilot. And everybody laughed. All the boys in the class laughed. And I started this kind of sending her pilot books, because I'm a kind of a pilot, just because I tried to escape the planet but failed. But So I tried to send her books and everywhere, and then she got a scholarship to study in London. I've lost track of where Rebecca is now, but I'm 100% convinced she's super successful. But it had less to do with money, and it had more to do with normalizing who you can be. It's such a powerful thing. You don't have to. I always thought it's easy to give money. I think it's harder to give your time. And it's harder to stay to stay the kind of the whole path in terms of how to get people out of just another shot, just a shot at doing something. It's exactly your point, Justinus. It's like you. I can't speak for the two of you, but for me, I didn't grow up particularly wealthy at all. But I had more opportunities than most people around me, for sure. And I took advantage of that. And that's the world we need to go and build.
It's fascinating because it always comes back to, for me, that two things is that the aptitude and the ability is normally distributed. And especially in countries like South Africa, the access to opportunities is completely asymmetrical. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that everybody with opportunity have access, because that's such a massive ROI when we invest in people with a high ceiling of ability but low access. It doesn't take a lot to give them access. I mean, it took, from the sounds of it, it didn't take much to give Rebecca the opportunities and access, and people then self-select out and they make the best of those opportunities, and they change the destiny for themselves, their siblings, their family, and the entire community that they are part of.
I agree, Justinus, and I think it's harder, right? If you think about this even more deeper, more philosophically, and you think about and say, how do people know that they can lift themselves out? How do people know that they can be somebody different? How do they know that? Because I was recently, right, in Sierra Leone, outside of Freetown, and we're kind of doing stuff there, and there's kids that grow up in a small village. It's literally, we've all heard these stories, but literally, if you're pregnant, you have to walk 2 hours to go and get to Freetown to get any type of medical care. Right, so we think we don't have an iPad, or hey, I'm not going to have a cool restaurant tonight to go and eat, or I have a difficult day at the office. And here you have people that have a very different set of problems. But when you get to that village and you have those small kids, they are hardwired to grow up and work in the fields. That's it. That's the ceiling. That's all they're thinking of. Now you have to get somebody in to widen that scope, that ceiling of who they can become. And that's not enough, right? You don't have to say, at least I'll give you one shot. You have to give a vehicle or a pathway to go and get out of that. Now, I'm not saying it's not a great place to go and live, or a noble way to live, by the way, or to make money. And I'm not saying making more money is the marker of success. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying everybody at least has to have a shot of being anything they can be.
But here's the interesting thing. I don't know if you've read Grit by Angela Duckworth. She talks about this exact point that you said, is that there's this fine line of hope that lives between learned helplessness or learned optimism. And it doesn't take a lot for people to move from learned helplessness to learned optimism, but it's really just that context, that example, seeing somebody else that can do it, opening a view, hearing one story, having a hero, these simple things that empower people to believe that they can actually change the outcome of their lives, instead of just accepting whatever their context have told them they need to accept, and they will never amount to more.
Agree, and I don't want to digress, Justinus, but I interviewed a guy in my team. He was the most senior FBI guy here in New York State. And I thought he asked me I never interview people. I just talk rubbish to people, because you want to learn about them. You know, because the technical stuff is kind of almost irrelevant. You can learn any technical stuff, right? So he asked me, Wayne, what makes people successful in your team? And I said to him, and this is universally true, people who are kind, people who are self-aware, people with humility, people who can say sorry, people who can teach, who can learn, people, again, who I said, who can anticipate, who can see around corners, people who don't take themselves too seriously. They always make it. If you're looking at it through the lens of, I'm going to make a connection here, hopefully, Justinus, to Angela Duckworth, but which is a cool name. If you think knowledge knowledge and technical skill is going to be your success capability. I've got bad news for you, but because, and I don't want to step into the swear word of AI, but knowledge and information is being democratized to a point where I can get anything. My daughter's studying here in kind of north of the city. She's studying kind of towards human development. There's a lot of space, by the way, in doing that. By the way, we've only scratched the surface. But and I had this discussion with her when she went to college, which there's a lot of tears, just like you, Justina. So I was mostly on my part. And I was saying to her, all you have to learn is to learn, the ability to learn, to know how to learn. Because the knowledge stuff is on your device. I grew up outside a small town in the Eastern Cape. If you ask me, Wayne, what's the capital of Mongolia? The only way to find that out, because most people on Patterson had no clue what Mongolia was, by the way. So the only way to find out is to get to the library, get a library card, which is hard those days, then learn the Dewey system, then get to the book, and then read to the book of Mongolia to know it's Ulaanbaatar. That's the only way to find that out. Today, you can ask me anything and I'll find it out immediately, whether that's through Grok or Perplexity or ChatGPT or Claude or anything like that. So we've got a generation of people that have skipped those steps 2, 3, 4, 5, and they've never learned or they've unlearned how to learn. And to answer your question or to kind of align with your statement, if we can rebuild a new generation that can learn these hard things, I think we're on the right path. There's this old saying, you don't want your children to die, but you want them to fall out of a tree. Right? Yeah. They have to learn this stuff, right? There's no shortcut in this.
That's such a good one. Just to change the narrative a little bit, Wayne. So, you always obviously been at the coalface of much more interesting stuff than the modern day life of me and Justina's. But then, going from protecting Mandela through a very turmoil period to protecting bankers in some capital cities in private jets, and people probably don't know who they are when they walk past them. How did you keep yourself interested and motivated, to keep the good work going?
The attraction was always, thanks for the question, Flip. I'm kind of way behind you and Justina's, but I'm catching up. I'm a quick learner. So I was always interested in the people side of things. I could never get my heart into the protection thing. I took my job seriously, and I still do for sure. But I'm always chasing the next thing. I'm always there's a friend, I think a mutual friend of ours, kind of Robin, that lives in Atlanta. She said this to me 20 years ago, right? When you're underwhelmed by the world, it stuck with me because it's so true. I'm not impressed by people that are famous or with titles. I've never been, and maybe that's because of Madiba. Maybe I can't remember why, but I've got a million stories. So I should probably write a book, and you should buy it because I need the money. But I, in all these kind of phenomenally kind of great places that I never thought I'll visit, from Monaco to Mongolia, interesting stories to finishing a bottle, a case of champagne with a guy in a group. I think the group's name is U2. I'm not 100% sure, but on a yacht in Monte Carlo. So all these things, I'm always fascinated from learning about people. Once you get to know them, those famous people and those less famous, we're all the same. You get back to, we're all the same.
We had a guest on earlier in the podcast, Andrew Farrell, who used to say, don't take yourself too seriously, but take what you do seriously.
Yeah. And I've got these, I don't want to jump around, Flip, but this was in 1999. We were at FNB Stadium outside Johannesburg, and Madiba with Deputy President Mbeki then was doing a whole kind of rally on the rally. There was about 100,000 people there, probably another 20, 30, 40,000 people outside. And there was a tunnel. There's 2 tunnels going into the stadium. The one tunnel was for VIPs, and the one tunnel was literally kind of that we would always have a kind of escape route for the president. So we all kind of, the cars were pulled in there, and there's this big wrought iron, massive gate, like a vehicle entrance gate. And then Mrs. Mandela, Winnie Mandela, her motorcade kind of pulls in there, and they want to get onto the pitch to go and join this. And everybody's arguing with them, and we all knew each other, of course, but they're arguing that you can't go through there, you have to go kind of somewhere else. And they didn't just want to listen. And at some point, she gets out of the car. She knew me. She kind of walks up to me and said, "Going to open the gate." And I said, "Not going to happen." I think I said it in a nice way. She goes, argues, and this becomes more escalated. And then there's these old, if you can picture this, old rusted padlocks. And I shut this padlock shut, and I said, "Nobody's going in here." And she had a kind of interesting reaction to me that I rather won't talk about. And she leaves, and all the kind of police guys and the military guys, they're like, great, Captain Hendricks, go, this is good, you saved the day. And I look at them, I said, and they say, kind of open the gate. It's like, I don't have a key. so I locked us in. So sometimes your kind of very decisiveness can go and backfire. So that's where the humility comes in. So we had to go get a bolt cutter very quickly, by the way, because we locked the president in and everybody else, and we locked ourselves in. So I wanted to stop the story at that decisiveness, but there was other side to it. I have to tell you a very quick story about self-awareness. I met with the head of intelligence at BlackRock, obviously a big kind of asset manager, and a good friend of mine is head of security, and he asked me to go and meet with their head of intelligence, and I'm sure it's the same in Europe or the UK or Canada. Canada being one of the states in the US, obviously, but or is it pronounced Canada? It's one of the two, but. So I meet with this guy, everybody's former agency or FBI or Secret Service, everybody. So I've met all 10 billion people from SEAL Team 6. So I meet with this guy, and my shtick is I can make people laugh. That's my thing. My children think I'm not funny, but everybody else hopefully think I'm funny. So I'm doing all my inappropriate Irish jokes, everything I can think of, nothing. This guy is not blinking. So somewhere we were having a coffee, and he asked me, "Wayne, what is your biggest challenge?" And I thought, this is my opportunity to make him laugh. So I say with a straight face, listen, my biggest challenge is assimilating with other people on this planet, because I'm so good looking, I'm so intelligent, and I'm so humble. I really struggle. So that perfection makes it hard for me to assimilate on this planet. So it's hard for me, and I have to dumb things down and try to get to the level where everybody else is. And he wrote it down. He wrote it down in his little Star Wars moleskin little book with bullet points. He wrote it down without blinking. And I never got the opportunity to tell him the true story, to correct him. So if he's listening, I promise it was a joke.
So how many countries have you visited in total now?
I've stopped counting. I don't know where I am. I'm kind of close to about 160. I've been to kind of most countries. The stands, the former Soviet Union stands, I've not been to all of them. There's a couple of small countries I've not been to in Europe that I just couldn't find the opportunity yet. But it's also just a point of when you go to a country, walk the streets, eat the food, talk rubbish with the people. Because otherwise it doesn't count, right? You can't get to know people if you go to. We've all experienced this. People come from Europe or the UK or the US. They travel to Johannesburg, right? They get a bodyguard or security, and they go to a 5-star hotel in Sandton, and then they come back and say, "I've been to Africa," and all three of us laugh then.
So how long have you been in New York now?
12 years, but 12 years, give or take. Yeah. So I've been here for some time. People love the accent, so I still try to keep it. I'm not like Charlize, right? It's like on the plane you lose the accent. I'm very proud of my accent, and my son here, Flip, he's the greatest, apart from you, obviously, the greatest Springbok export product ever. He goes to school in a Springbok rugby jersey. He's got a rugby ball. He has convinced people to play rugby during break time at the school. He insists on telling people that South Africa is 1,000,000 times better than the United States, right? He literally does that, right? And he explains that, and he throws in choice Afrikaans words. So yeah, we've lived for a long time in New York, but we've deliberately never lost the connection.
That's probably a good next thing is like, so you obviously keep the South African roots very much alive. How do you keep the South Africanness, living in New York? It's not, you can't just go and buy meat at the next shop for a braai or braaibroodjies, and your neighbors probably think you setting the house alight when you do it. So how do you keep the South Africanness?
Well, listen, it's one American at a time. There's a couple to go, but and I call it, and you can kind of use this phrase, but literally, I'm teaching them culture. So, right, I mean, and culture means what you eat and how you speak, and how you behave, and what music you listen to, and all of that stuff. So I openly have conversations all the time about South Africa. I'm extremely proud of my language. I mean, how many countries have their own language? We have our own language. I'm super proud of that. I'm proud of being a South African. And that also gives me an opportunity to criticize my country if I need to. But I can do both at the same time. That doesn't. I love my wife, but I also have aggressive debates with her about various. I've never won a debate, but I'll keep on trying. But I do that through literally telling people about the good things about South Africa, because most what they learn and hear are the bad news stories. No, I'm not saying those are not true. Of course they are. But I'm just saying there's another side to that. And if you take the time, and I always start end the conversation with, hey, if you ever go to South Africa or you want to go, let me know, and I'll kind of hook you up with the right people to go and truly experience the country. So I always do my bit, but I make my own kind of biltong, which I like doing. I always sniff out, this is South African thing, by the way, sniff out kind of where you can find a South African shop that sells boerewors. I was recently in Delray Beach in Florida, and there's actually 2 South African shops there, which again speaks to the entrepreneurial spirit. The South Africans, they left the country. They got there, and what did they do first? They replicated South Africa, because they maybe they did that subconsciously because that's who they are. Maybe they saw an opportunity, but I definitely keep that alive. We live here on 5.5 acres. I'm not sure how many hectares that is, like 2 hectares or something like that. But we live here, so I entice all the Americans to come and visit. We have a braai, and I'm very specific to explain to them that stop with this gas thing. That's just honestly, that's a sin in the Old Testament, let alone the New Testament. So stop with that. Don't do the gas thing. It's ugly. It's kind of disgusting. So make a fire, teach them how to shoot a crossbow. And then kind of, and there's a step 3 as well that may or may not include bourbon, but in that hopefully in that order. Sometimes we get the order wrong.
Yeah, there's like the two trains of thought, as you said earlier. When you get to a place, it's very important for me personally to appreciate the culture, to adopt the culture, to understand what the people there is about, walk the streets, eat their foods, drink their beer. I think that's very important. And then, as we all are, eventually we start braaiing and we start greeting our neighbors and we start being friendly. And I get myself when I go on a run or a cycle, this little passive aggressiveness. If I greet someone and they don't greet me back, I will then get very loudly. I'll say hello.
What about kind of your experiences? Have you have something similar? I don't want to kind of to turn the books on you. I hate when people do that, but is kind of is completely different or same reasons?
Oh, so for me, it also sort of happened by accident because I just sold my or left the business I'd spent 13 years building in South Africa, and we were on a ski trip in Europe. and I was 34 at the time, and the kids was 4 and 2. And I said to my wife, I've always wanted to go live in a ski resort for a winter. And if we don't do it now, I'm going to start a new business, and all the kids are going to be in school, and then we won't be able to do it. So why don't we just go spend a winter in a ski resort, ski every day, and get this bug out of our system? And we did that, and we had so much fun. We ended up going back for the second season, and before we knew it, we were living in Canada. So it sort of happened almost by accident.
For me, the same is why I obviously came for rugby. Stayed way longer than I thought I would ever. Try and make it. I think it's the hard-headedness of South Africa. Not that we are at all, but no. Justina's has been here, so we have the little web out and we try and make it as South Africa as possible. But it will always stay temporary. It won't never become home.
But here's the question that drives me, Wayne, and I'd love to hear your opinion on it. How do we build a country that works for everybody? How do we make sure South Africa reaches its full potential, not just on the rugby field, but as a place where everybody has the opportunity to be successful?
I'll definitely say something controversial, right? That a lot of my friends in South Africa would react to strongly. I always thought the answer, when people ask me, I would say the answer for South Africa lies with the ANC. And then when I say that, people will get kind of very worked up. And I'll try to explain that. It's less the ANC, because remember there's two ANCs. There's the ANC of the values of making everybody kind of equal. And then there's the ANC that most of us are experiencing today. And those, in terms of values and where the ANC started, are two different parties. And I was kind of thought, when the ANC loses control of the narrative, that's when the country will be in trouble, and that's what's happening now. Now we got spoiled by this whole Rainbow Nation idea. We looked at it. I mean, if you think about this in how other countries have gone through hard times and evolution and change, we looked at it in 1990, and in 1994 we thought it was done. So when people said it was bloodless and it's a Rainbow Nation, it's a miracle nation, what's the saying today? Hold my beer. Right? It's like I think we got spoiled by the 4-year kind of timeline window, and then we thought it's all over. And I thought the hard work only started then. Madiba always said he wasn't a good president, but nobody asked him kind of why. What did he mean by that? He was the right leader for our country then. He wasn't a particular great economist like President Mbeki. He wasn't a great administrator, particularly like President Mbeki, but he was the right leader for what we needed then. And I always thought the one thing that I think we could have done better if we had some control over life and the universe is having another term of him, because that would have given us a more robust foundation for answering your question, Justinus. I think we skipped a couple of steps, and we expected, if you say the word rainbow 3 times fast, then it becomes true. I think that's not happening. I think it's a little bit of a country of our own goals as well. I think we've lost that. I think the way to do it, and I certainly don't have all the answers, is we need to get all the people on the same values plane. We're not there yet. We have a void. We have a vacuum in leadership in South Africa, in my view. Now that's a general comment, and I'm not just talking about politicians. I don't think you earn the badge of leader if you tell people how to fix this and you're not stepping into the fray, if you're not putting yourself out there. I think we all should play a role in that. Number 2 is we have to get out of our heads of this, and I'm not making light of this whole thing of mapping back to apartheid. We have to say we should never forget apartheid. Absolutely not. because it's all the ugliness and evilness that we should never ever repeat, but we have to step away from that and get on with it. Now I know this is hard for sure, but this is possible. We have to make sure our children absolutely know about apartheid, how we got to apartheid and how we got out of apartheid. And then say how we got out of apartheid is a journey. You are part of that journey. You have to contribute to that. The second we step back to, and we're always on the cusp of that, if we step back to looking at people through the lens of color, we're going to get in trouble. I really believe that. I'm looking at, I don't know how many people we have in South Africa now, 50 million, 55 million. Here's a kind of great, phenomenal country with great resources and literally just great people, all of those people. And they have the right recipe for being successful. It's we need to take ownership of that. All of us, me included, even though I don't live there anymore, and maybe I live there again tomorrow. We have to take ownership of that and step back in and say we have to go and rebuild that, but build that on the vision of the ANC, how the ANC started, and how this whole thing of this is not acceptable. If you are still in a mindset, whoever you are, of the mindset of I'm not going to reset, and those people are different than me. We're never going to get out of it. It is not simple. It is hard. And I look at the US, right, in a big way, stepping into that, into that similar environment. And I always tell people here, it is not a romantic comedy. It is a horror movie. Right, you are making obvious mistakes, and if you don't believe me, go and ask a South African, black or white. Go and ask them, and this is not an experiment that'll end well. So I don't know the answers, Justinus, apart from it starts with a heavy dose of you have to take ownership and you have to get out of your own head, which Flip will know far better than me on a million levels, right? To perform at the kind of highest level, you have to be able to reset quickly when you drop a ball, when you miss a tackle, whatever it is. How quickly can you reset and become that high performer again? That's always I've always thought those are the actual winners. Those are the cool kind of high performing people.
But I think that's interesting there, Wayne. I think I completely agree. Is that every one of us should take ownership and participate and be part of the solution, even if we live 10,000 miles away. And I also agree that founding place should be that we can all be equal. I think part of the challenge, and while I agree with your sentiment around we have to move from what happened in the past, I think it's very hard to do when the inequalities we still face in society is a direct result of that. So we have to figure out a way to create opportunities. And I it's funny that the way you talked about the ANC reminds me a lot of Rolf Meyer and how he spoke about it, especially at the time when the National Party eventually did they merge, or I can't remember what happened, into the ANC. And I remember listening to Rolf Meyer on the radio, and he had a very similar sentiment to what you said. And now, not ironically, but he's the ambassador now in the US. But really understanding and giving this message that we have to look at this problem from the view of where the majority of South Africans are, and that founding of the ANC is where a lot of people are still is. And if we really want to solve the problem, we have to incorporate everybody in building towards the solution.
I agree, and I kind of know Rolf kind of reasonably. I worked for him for some time, kind of in early 1994 as well. I thought he's one of those great people. I think he'll have success on the diplomatic front here in Washington. But again, right, the AGOA stuff and the stuff about trade and kind of properly resetting the relationships is between the White House and the union buildings for sure. I agree with you, Justinus. Maybe I'm looking at it through a personal lens. I've never been a victim. I've just never been, right? I've had extreme adversity in my life, right? We've all have those stories where you sit in a dark room and you say, how do I get out of this? Right? It's Justinus's and Flip's fault. It's their fault. It's their fault, right? I didn't get the opportunities that Flip got to become a phenomenal rugby player, right? I didn't get the opportunities that he got, and that may be true, or it may be that he didn't get a million other opportunities also, right? But through hard work and luck and timing and somebody giving an opportunity, he got to where he was. I think that's par for the course. I think back to apartheid today, in my view, still plays a role in how many people grow up in South Africa. Black people, 100%. And if we don't want to have that conversation, happy to buy everybody a beer and a cigar and get into it. But it's true. But it's also true that we have to play a role to get those people out of truth. We can't say, because let me give you a hard one here. If you say, okay, so 50 years from now, that could still be true. No, the better question is why. But why is that true? Why is that true 26 years later? Right? If you draw comparisons, and these are not fair for the record, if you draw comparisons between a Singapore and Malaysia, a Singapore and South Africa, an Australia and South Africa on a historic timeline, if you draw parallels with really poor communities in India, and you draw those comparisons with China. What sets those people apart? If we think apartheid's evil, period, right? That's an obvious fact, horrible. Do we think we're the only country that went through something really ugly and bad? We're not. I think that's one thing that us as South Africans have to really kind of get away from, is this thing of something happened to us. We're the only people this evil, bad stuff happened to. It's what happens next that makes us great people. Now, it's easy for me to say, I'm sitting in New York here, kind of talking about this on a podcast, right, with a fancy computer. Now, you're sitting, right, in real extreme poverty and you've not eaten for 3 days, right, and you don't know what's going to happen next. And if you're not seeing your parents in a week or 2 weeks, it's a very different conversation. Absolutely. That's why this comes back to all three of us and everybody in South Africa that's got the means have to connect with those people. That's what it is. This is a conversation as much about leadership as everything else. I read an interesting article over the weekend, actually, where the private sector is starting to usurp to play the role of government in a big way in South Africa. That's not unique, by the way. It happens here in the US all the time, where private sector is stepping into where there's a hole. That's one way of doing it. But I think it can't just be, you're a victim, I'm so sorry, and I'm walking away. That is not good enough.
No, I completely agree. But it's up to us, and it's up to all of us to change that.
Yep.
You personally, what is your dream, and what would you like to do to help South Africa?
I think there's a lot to be done in Africa. So we always look at South Africa through the lens of the Western world. I wonder how much we can kind of bring that South African entrepreneurship in an accelerated, bigger, optimized way into Africa. Now, you think about ShopRite and MTM and Vodacom and so on. They've been massively successful, and others in bringing that. But I can tell you now, there's a bunch of South African farmers here in the US, in Mississippi, in Tennessee. They are in Canada as well. They are in a massive, big way in Brazil. They are in Morocco. They're obviously in Australia. They're also in China, where Zambia, where they're doing a lot of agricultural kind of innovation. Absolutely. I think South Africa, I think the answer is not just let's go and invest in South Africa. I think a lot of that is also bring South African expertise that's magnificent into Africa. If you think about Roelof Botha, Roelof Botha, Elon Musk, obviously, Kimball Musk. Think about people don't speak about Mark Suzman. I think he's the great nephew of Helen Suzman. He's the CEO of Gates Foundation. Marco, the owner of the Sharks, he lives here in my town, by the way. I'm actually meeting him for coffee in a couple of days. But and this is all. There's this kind of massive group of South Africans. I also know kind of Flip van der Merwe now, by the way. These are all these great, successful South Africans, right, that can go out and, at the minimum, kind of spread the word and said, hey, here's somebody that's doing cool, technical stuff, farming in Stellenbosch. Let me connect you with somebody over there. It takes nothing. It's free. It's 30 seconds of your life to say, hey, if you want to solve this problem, I know somebody that's somewhere in South Africa. Let me make the connection. I think building that network is so extremely powerful, and that's kind of one way of doing it. I constantly think about your question, Justinus, about how to go and do that. In my tiny, small way, I tell the success story, the good news story about South Africa, and I try to connect people in that way and pay it forward.
As we get towards the end, we love to ask this question. Flippy, you do it.
We've got World Cup coming up, 2027. If all goes well, we hopefully see the Springboks in around the finals again. Where will you be watching the Springboks win the 2027 World Cup?
I have an extremely urgent crisis meeting in Australia over that time. I mean, I cannot believe the luck that I will be in where's the final getting played? In Sydney? In Sydney, yeah. I will be in Sydney during that high crisis period, exactly during that time. I've booked my business trip already. I've secured
for the crisis that you don't know what it's going to be.
For the crisis, no, I 100% know. There's be a massive crisis there.
You'll create it.
I'll create it, right? Hopefully, the crisis will be around the All Blacks or Australia losing again.
Exactly. I mean, I'm big enough, Wayne. If you need more protection by brute force or by technique, I'll come help you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Wayne. That was a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Wayne, very insightful. Thank you very much. We'll see each other in Baltimore.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for your time, man.
Of course.